Well, I mentioned before that I wanted to ask you a question about 1990 WCW, and I have some audio to play here with it. I found this fascinating. Just this past week on John Arezzi's Pro Wrestling Spotlight Then and Now, which is a show where we review the classic episodes of Pro Wrestling Spotlight from 30 years ago. We're up to February 4th, 1990. So this is a week before the Clash of Champions where Sting gets hurt. This is a week before Mike Tyson gets knocked out by Buster Douglas, which throws WWE's plans. A lot of people forget they got a lot of success out of Tyson in 1998. They tried to bring him in 1990 to be a guest referee. Yes, and they were trying to stir up publicity then. So there's a lot of things happening. It's a real news-centric episode.
And then all of a sudden Tyson gets knocked out and they're like, well, who do we have? Buster Douglas? Fuck it. They just didn't do anything.
No, they brought Buster Douglas in to be guest referee.
That's right.
Match.
They did do Buster Douglas and nobody gave a shit.
But the rumors were at the time that they were allegedly trying to do Randy Savage versus Mike Tyson at WrestleMania, which if there was one guy in that company to put him in with, that was probably the guy because he would script out the match and come up with something. With that said, John's guest, he has two guests on this week's show. It's a news-centric episode. Steve Beverly and Dave Meltzer. And the Steve Beverly stuff was really fascinating, and I want you to hear this, and I want to get your thoughts on it. We've talked so much about Tully Blanchard and about Jim Herd blowing
Well, now, wait a minute. One second. Steve Beverly, just so everybody knows, was at the time was doing a newsletter called Matt Watch. But Steve goes back in local television years and also has taught television classes and, loves the TV classics and et cetera, and is still around out there. Hello, Steve. But anyway, so he was somewhat of a television expert and then a wrestling fan who would talk about wrestling as it applied to television, just so everybody knows who Steve was.
And unfortunately, he's kind of a forgotten guy nowadays. I mean, Dave Meltzer's still around, but Steve Beverly was right there with him on these episodes. And when you hear him, it'll stand out. In an era where anyone anoints themselves a wrestling journalist, and they go on social media, and because they watched wrestling, they're a wrestling journalist. This is a guy who sounds like he knows what he's talking about. He sounds like an adult. And you'll hear it here. But why I want to play this for you is two things. One is, I want you to hear this and tell me what you remember about the Tully Blanchard stuff. And two, how inside WCW was Steve Beverly? Because it sounds like he knew exactly what was about to happen. And I'm going to guess he was talking to either Jim Herd or someone high up. But let me play you this. It's a couple minutes. Tell me your thoughts after we play this.
There are other rumors that I've heard this week regarding the return of Tully Blanchard to the NWA. Now, have you heard anything about that?
Well, I know that there have been talks. I know Blanchard was in the office as late as another day this week. He was in the office at the Atlanta office of Jim Herd in the NWA on week before last, and on Thursday of that week, Blanchard and his agent, I understand, were tossed out of Herd's office because they were making what the company felt were unreasonable demands. But that negotiations were to be continuing this week, and I am really of the strong belief that Blanchard, unless they were not able to make out a money deal on this, will probably be on that show, but they would like to keep that a secret if they could.
Mm-hmm. Well, it won't be a secret here, obviously, but...
I'm really expecting Tully to show up, but if he's not there, it's simply because they were not able to work out a financial arrangement.
Now, as far as the Four Horsemen go, we feel here at the Pro Wrestling Spotlight with what's been taking place on television, Ric Flair speaking to Woman, that there's going to be some type of turn, maybe even this coming Tuesday night. What are your opinions as far as that goes, the Four Horsemen turning on Sting, perhaps?
Well, let's put it this way. A lot of planted scenarios are out there right now because they'd like for people like myself and Dave Meltzer and others who do widely read newsletters to be wrong. And I don't mind if that happens because, I'm a fan still like everybody else, and I enjoy being surprised. But put it this way, I've always prefaced remarks like this by saying, people, don't take me for Jimmy the Greek because I sure don't want you going out to your neighborhood bookie on this. But my own belief is that you're going to see a turn of some kind. And I don't think, but what it is the case, I don't think it's going to happen when a lot of people think it's going to. I don't think it's going to happen in the cage. I would strongly suspect that it may happen well before that. The show. I don't think it's going to happen when the cage match itself begins.
You think it might happen before that, during the show Tuesday night?
Possibly. Particularly if Blanchard's there. Don't be surprised if it doesn't happen in an interview segment beforehand. That's pure guessing on my part, but I wouldn't be surprised at that. We'll see how my forecasting is on Tuesday night.
Great. Our co-host, Broadway Sonny Blaze, pro wrestler, wants to just have a couple words with you, Steve.
Hi. How you been, Steve?
I'm great. How about yourself?
Very well, thank you. I wanted to ask you now, if the Four Horsemen injure Sting badly enough, will Luger take his place on the 25th?
What the fuck?
Yeah, sure, that would happen, but I don't think that's going to happen.
You don't see that happening?
Don't take that one to the bank. I think that match is going to be Flair versus Sting, no ifs, ands, or buts on February 25th. And the company is capable of doing anything to try to throw everybody off, but I am very strongly of the belief that it's going to be Flair Sting on the 25th.
Well, there it is, Steve Beverly, February 4th, 1990.
So wait a minute, Sonny Beach is calling the actual fucking...
Sonny Blaze.
Or Sonny Blaze, Sonny Beach, Sonny Blaze, calling what actually happened before we knew it was actually going to happen.
Yeah, that's the crazy part where, what if they injure Sting too bad, will Luger take his place, but...
Holy God, but okay, here's the thing with Steve Beverly. Yes, he was talking to a variety of people because here's the thing. Steve Beverly had a real television background. He'd worked in TV news. He taught or has taught television classes, I think, at Auburn. He knew how to speak the language. And he talked not only to Jim Herd, who, talked to TV people, but also Joe Pedicino. Was obviously friends with Steve. So he was talking to people in the office. But here is the thing. If he's saying Tully had just been there and his agent, I assume, was his lawyer, I wrote the goddamn format for the Clash of Champions that they're talking about. I was under Ric Flair and Kevin Sullivan. It's not that I wrote the thing by myself. I'm the one who actually put pen to paper and wrote the format that we sent into the office to have typed up based on their direction, right? But I was on the creative team. Tully Blanchard was never going to be on that Clash of Champions. Not that I fucking remember. Not only that, but after I argued vociferously with Jim Herd about his decision not to bring Tully in when Arn came, or when Arn was coming because of the drug test failure in the WWF, he flat shut it fucking down, and that's the last time that I heard Tully Blanchard's word from his mouth. Tully, if Tully was back, and Flair was still the booker at that point, so if Tully was back and Flair knew, or Tully was coming back or talking about coming back, and Flair knew about it, he would have said something to me and Kevin. I don't remember anything about that ever being said. But at the same time, I'm wondering if Tully wasn't hot at Flair at that point and that's probably why he had his lawyer there, because they were probably trying to figure out a way to sue WCW if he couldn't get his fucking job that he was promised and the money that he was promised, because that's what knocked Tully out of mainstream wrestling. So that's very interesting. And but I can tell you for a flat fact that this is one of the things that Rick used to get hot about also. Me, Rick, and Kevin, even though we would have meetings with Jim Herd and Barnett and Jody Hamilton, and Jim Ross was in them, and one or two other people at some various points in time in the office, me and Rick and Kevin would do the brunt of the actual details of what was going to go on the TV formats in the car going somewhere, or while we were traveling on the road and go to a hotel or something or other, right? But since back in the old, there was no email, what we would do is we would decide what we were going to do, and then I would write out the formats because I had the best handwriting and I was the junior members. That's what the junior member does. I'd write them out, time them out, and fax them into the office where Janie Engel could type them up and distribute them at the taping. Because none of us were typists, right? Somebody in the office was seeing those formats and was then blabbing about what they saw, because that's the only way that anybody would have known that Sting was going to be turned on by the Horsemen in the interview segment before the match that night, which was always the plan. And then the only reason that things went south in the match was Sting was supposed to come out and try to get into the cage to get at the Horsemen after they beat Gary Hart's group. And that was the finale of the Clash of Champions, was supposed to be Sting trying to get into the cage to get revenge against Flair, and Flair going, come on, and having the Horsemen there with him. When Doug Dillinger, head of security, former Charlotte police officer, and Crockett TV cameraman, Doug Dillinger, for a shoot, pulled Sting down off the cage, jerked him down. When he landed wrong on his fucking leg and tore his ACL. And that's why he was out for 6 months. And that's why it ended up being Luger. And that night, I went to Rick after we knew that Sting was fucked, because you can tell with an ACL injury, he ain't going to fucking work the pay-per-view in 2 weeks or whatever. I said, what are we going to do? He said, well, let me think about it overnight. We'll talk about it. We'll fly tomorrow, because we were going to go from Corpus Christi to wherever the fuck. He said, we'll fly tomorrow to Dallas or wherever, and we'll talk about it, because I was going to drive that night. So I said, fuck it. So the next morning when we got to the airport, he had already decided, I'm switching Luger. I'm putting Luger in the spot. I'm going to switch him babyface, which was kind of if not a repeat of the angle, an homage to when Magnum TA got hurt in the car wreck and suddenly Nikita came out to defend his honor. There was elements of that in Rick's thinking, and also Luger was the only other guy that they would buy that made sense, and he knew that, it was a make or break time, because he had been booking this thing to be the big fucking, he was going to drop the title to Sting. He was going to do a big buy rate. Well, he didn't drop the title to Luger because it came out of nowhere, and he had promised the title to Sting. It may have helped Luger at the time, but long term it would have thrown off what they wanted to do with Sting. But that was the chain of events of how that happened. So not only for Steve Beverly to know that it was going to take place beforehand, he had to have been told by somebody that saw one of the formats that we faxed into the office, which narrows it down quite a bit to a Joe Pedicino or a JR or Jim Hurd. It's really spooky that Sunny Blaze Beach, Sunny Days would have called that fucking bit at the end when that was never a plan until it actually became a shoot.
Another thing mentioned on this show was, what do you remember about, there was a big super show going to happen in Tokyo with All Japan and New Japan working together, and Ric Flair and Muta were both supposed to be on the show, and they pulled out, which led to talks with Vince McMahon about doing something with the Japanese promotions. Do you remember why Ric Flair was pulled off that show?
If it's the one I'm thinking about, and somebody that's, better versed in this can clarify it or correct me if I'm wrong, but was that not the time that they informed Flair that he would be going to Japan, but it would be covered as part of his WCW guarantee?
Oh, you know what? That may be it. Yeah.
Because basically you got a guy who's been going to Japan to defend the NWA title and getting these big payoffs from Giant Baba for fucking however long, right? And in addition to whatever he made in this country. And all of a sudden, WCW says, oh, yeah, you're going to go to Japan. You're going to be the main event in the big show in the Tokyo Dome or wherever the fuck it was, but we're not paying you extra. That's part of your contract. That happened at least once. Whether it was this specific time, I cannot say.
I think it would have been this specific time, because a year later it was where he had the match with Fujinami in Tokyo, so it wouldn't have been there.
Yeah, well, and see, that makes sense because it was earlier in the run that they owned WCW, and they didn't know how the fucking business worked, and they didn't know how Flair worked, and there was all kinds of issues at that time anyway. And then right after the Clash of Champions and right before the pay-per-view, was it not? No, it was right after the pay. When did he quit as booker?
After the pay-per-view, I believe.
Right after the pay-per-view. Anyway, it was a mess at that point in time, but very interesting.
You can hear more classic wrestling news PWSpod.com, or look for John Arezzi's Pro Wrestling Spotlight wherever you find your favorite podcasts.